Well, it's very, very important that we spend time together like we're doing this morning, and I know there's a lot of reasons that you could think of and say, okay, yeah, it's good to be around other Christians, and we could make a pretty good list. I think one of the important reasons to be together is we're kind of fighting becoming more like the world. It's kind of a resistance. It's our default setting seems to be to become like everybody else, and part of our job as Christians is to be in the world but not of the world. And so part of why we're here this morning is, I guess, to kind of realign our thinking, whether through class or maybe the lesson this morning and focusing on the prayers and singing. We're kind of realigning our thinking and make sure it's not tainted. I think that's one of the greatest dangers, is that we're affected by the world. We kind of begin to think like the world because we're bombarded, and we know that, either in conversations or television, radio. There's all kinds of things. There's just constant flow of ideas towards us that we have to kind of resist. And sometimes you can see that kind of peeking through in our lives through certain words and phrases. I think of it as certain words and phrases that the world teaches us. And it's very subtle sometimes, and sometimes it's pretty obvious. And one of them, I've mentioned before, but I think it's one that's a dead giveaway. It's a concept that the world trains us to think in these terms. And I've had friends who have either said this or who have known people well. In fact, my good friend, his father, I remember, used this very phrase to excuse a lot of his decisions, and it's this. It's a very, very handy phrase. It's my life. And you have either, maybe we've even said it, maybe you've been the one spoken to, but that is a very handy phrase that the world teaches us. It's my life. And unfortunately, not always, but unfortunately it's used many times to justify what we know is wrong. It's clearly an idea that belongs to the world. We might even argue, I think sometimes if you were to trace sins back to their starting point, you would probably find this basic selfish concept at the root. It's my life. And we know selfishness has no place in Christianity. We all have to struggle with it. I think it's a constant battle for all of us. It takes great effort to not be selfish and to think along those terms. It's my life. A pure, unselfish action, strangely enough, is admired by everybody, even in the world. Even the world admires somebody who doesn't live by this idea, it's my life. And I thought I'd share this with you. This is a true story. It has to do with the airport in Chicago. I don't know if any of you have been to Chicago. You've probably heard of the O'Hare Airport. And maybe you heard about this. It's named after a military hero. His name was Butch O'Hare. And he was from Chicago. That's why they named the airport after him. But he was famous for being a fighter pilot in World War II. And the story goes that he was flying and was separated from his squadron, and he was low on fuel, about to run out of gas, and he turned back. He turned around to head back towards the aircraft carrier where he would land and be safe. And on his way back, he saw a squadron of enemy planes, and they had done a surprise attack on the American fleet. All the American planes were away on a mission, and all the ships were helpless without them. And it just so happened that Butch's plane, because it was out of gas, he was the only plane in the vicinity to do anything about it. So Butch O'Hare dove his plane into the formation of the enemy. He shot several times, and then he ran out of ammo. So then he began to dive into the formation, trying to clip the wings off the enemy planes, or at least the tail section. And finally, the enemy formation was so intimidated by this guy, this one solitary plane flown by Butch O'Hare, that they left. He chased them off, just this one guy without any ammo and just a plane that was almost out of gas, and he was clearly a hero, and he was held up as a great example of self-sacrifice. Now, here was a man who didn't say, it's my life. Even the world recognizes this as heroism, and maybe that heroism is available to us to a certain extent. This approach to life is expected of a Christian. It's not something exceptional. It's part of what defines a Christian. A Christian lives by the concept of self-sacrifice. There's absolutely no room in a Christian's life to say, it's my life. Philippians 2 is just read for us, verse 3. Philippians 2, starting at verse 3. I'm going to read part of this. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Can you imagine saying it's my life after reading this? Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. And it goes on further to explain that this is how Jesus lived. That's how he lived his life. So anyone who claims to follow him has to live their life this way too. We're not focused on ourselves, but on other people. This is emphasized even greater in 1 Corinthians 6. It gets pretty pointed. Here's 1 Corinthians 6:19. And I think I'm sure you've read this before, but kind of place this next to the person saying, it's my life. You can understand why quickly we can conclude a Christian can't say that. 1 Corinthians 6:19. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? You are not your own, for you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. It's pretty clear that the arrangement for a Christian is you are not your own. You don't belong to you, which is kind of a startling thing. You've been bought with a price. Some people are put off by this, and they think of being a Christian as slavery, and that's exactly what it is. It's nothing less. It's true. If you're not a slave to God, you are absolutely free. You're free to belong to the devil. That's what Jesus says in John 8. He explains this very clearly. You are a slave no matter what. You only get to choose your master. That's what it comes down to. It's the ultimate paradox. The only way you will ever truly be free is to make sure you completely belong to God. So if you're a Christian, there's no way you could say, this is my life. You're going to put others before yourself, and you've been bought by God. Here's yet another reason your life is not your own. If you're married, you don't belong to you even more. Ephesians 5:22 says, wives, subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. Ephesians 5:28, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. If you're married, life becomes a mission to make sure your spouse comes first. So if a Christian is married, your life is not your life, but even more so. You could argue that a husband or wife is the last person that could say, it's my life. But I'm going to suggest this morning there's another very important reason why this life doesn't belong to you alone. You have a very powerful effect on everyone around you. So many connections just in this room. A lot of us are related physically, of course, spiritually, friends and family. So many ways that we're connected. And that's not even counting the spiritual connections as brothers and sisters. You could argue that these are the most powerful connections of all, as our spiritual connections as brothers and sisters. Many others fall under these categories who aren't here, who aren't part of this congregation, and they are just as important to you. All of these connections lead to a very significant conclusion. There's a lot of people that are connected to you. About this time of year, we always watch It's a Wonderful Life. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. And it's a movie that emphasizes how one person can affect so many people in so many big ways. We convince ourselves, though, this is one of the lies that we tell ourselves, provided by the world. We convince ourselves that it's possible to sin and have it only affect us. And that's often why we use the idea, it's my life. I don't buy it. There is no sin, if allowed to continue, that will only affect the sinner. If sin is allowed to continue, it begins to affect us as an individual, and it gradually will make you into a different person. And that's the person who will affect others, the people that you care about deeply. This point is seen most clearly in one particular instance in Matthew 18, in something that Jesus says. Jesus uses some pretty drastic words here to make his point and make sure that we know about this connection and how we need to be careful about our decisions. Matthew 18, verse 6, and he's talking about children. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. A pretty violent image. And when you read this passage, parents might come to mind, and that's good. Reminds you of the responsibility as parents that you're reminded that you're in charge of a little soul. But it doesn't say parents. This is for all of us. We forget how much they watch everyone. My sister, I remember, referred to her kids as little tape recorders. And you know, some of the things that you least consider them hearing is what they take to heart and remember. All of us carry the responsibility. They're watching us and learning it, not just at church, not just at the assembly. It might motivate us to walk away from sin and realize that this is not my life. There is someone following me. There's a story of a father who was walking through some pretty deep snow, and his son was following him, and he was little enough to where he had to step in each of his father's tracks in order to make some headway. He was right behind him, and he said, "Daddy, I'm following in your footsteps." And it really hit this guy. And it made him reconsider a lot of the things he'd been doing and some of the plans that he had. It hit him really hard. He was determined to make better choices because he literally saw that someone was following his footsteps. And it's good to remind ourselves it isn't your life, and that's a very good thing. First, it belongs to God. Then we're commanded to live for other people, especially when it comes to your spouse and also children. All of these are good reasons to turn away from the sin that we often let creep into our lives. And we justify it because we think it's only affecting me. That's exactly what the devil hopes you think. Every decision we make, little or small, will have greater influence than you realize. Every day when we live our life, the decisions between right and wrong are a battle. I know. Some of it's easy and some of it's difficult. I know that for a fact in my own life. It's important to keep in mind that you're not just fighting for yourself. Nehemiah, you probably know, was in charge of repairing a ruined city. If you want to turn to Nehemiah 4, I think I've shared this with you before, but it really stands out to me. Nehemiah chapter 4 is where we're headed. He was put in charge of repairing a ruined city. Jerusalem was in shambles, and he's given the responsibility of rebuilding the walls. And while he's rebuilding the walls, their enemies are trying to stop him. They're trying to interfere. So Nehemiah had to come up with some pretty unusual strategies, and one in particular is the one that I want to point out. It's in Nehemiah 4:14, one of his key and very effective strategies to rebuild the wall while the enemies were trying to stop him. This is Nehemiah 4:14. "When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." He positioned the people in families because he knew they'd fight harder. And this might help us the next time to make when a decision comes along, to fight not just for ourselves, but for the people that we love. I'm going to tell you one more story before we wrap this up. I told you about Butch O'Hare from Chicago. There was another man from Chicago, and one day he made a very important decision, a decision that involved self-sacrifice on the deepest level, figuratively and literally. They called him Easy Eddie. That was his name. Everybody knew him by that. And he had always lived his life to make money. That was his main goal. His name was Easy Eddie. And he went to school, and he became a lawyer, and then an opportunity came along, and he made a decision. He ended up representing a man named Al Capone, and if you don't know your history, he was not a good guy. He was a crook. He was a criminal, a murderer. Just about everything about him spoke of immoral behavior. And yet, Easy Eddie had this opportunity to defend Al Capone, and that's why he got the name Easy Eddie. And he made a lot of money from Al Capone. Easy Eddie had a big house and a lot of luxuries, all of it paid for by the mob. And then something happened. Eddie's wife had a son, and Eddie started thinking about his life, looking at his son and realizing that his decisions were going to affect his son's life, and he thought about trying to do what was right. He wanted to be a good example to his son, and he thought about it for a long time, and he made a very, very difficult decision. He decided to go straight and leave the mob, and he decided to testify even against the mob, and he knew what it would cost him. He was putting his life on the line But he was determined to be an example to his son, and so he testified. And within a year, he was dead. He was shot down in the street in Chicago. But it made a huge impact on his son. He taught his son about doing the right thing even if it cost you your life. Eddie's son learned this lesson from his father, and he ended up living life after his father's example. Eddie's son grew up to be a pilot. Eddie's son flew a plane in World War II, and his name was Butch O'Hare, the hero. His dad, the crook, ended up influencing his son, who became a very memorable man who lived by the statement, "It's not my life." The world is trying to change you and to try to get you to think things like that. It's my life, to live for yourself. Anyone who has any clear perspective on life knows this isn't possible. There's too many connections. As Christians, we can't even think about such a thing. We belong to God. We belong to each other. We must remember that we have influence on everybody around us, our spouse, the children that are around us, and this might give us many reasons to turn away from sin. If you're not a Christian, you need to know your life will never be as good as you hope until you belong to God. And we're going to be singing a song, and one option for you is to come forward and have the opportunity to be baptized. This decision will affect your life. It will also make you into a person who can become the best version of you. Not that you won't make mistakes, but even your mistakes can end up resulting in blessings. If you're a Christian, don't forget every decision we make, the little decisions and big decisions, make a world of difference for us and all the many, many people that you love. Pray you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.